Hello! Today I'm delving back into the worlds of Final Fantasy with a considered look at the opening act of each of the PS1 trilogy of titles, and deconstructing what it is that makes these introductions succeed so well. Now, it may seem like a niche element of the Final Fantasy games to focus on, but I've always found it interesting how video games, and particularly the Final Fantasy games, go about establishing story, establishing character, not to mention onboarding players to the gameplay mechanics and the characteristics of the title in the opening stanza. And more than any other series perhaps, Square has consistently evolved how it approaches the opening moments of these games, suiting them to particular themes and stories, and indeed aligning to the possibilities of changing and evolving technology. So in this episode, I'm breaking down 3 Final Fantasy game introductions, 7, 8 and 9, that I think really succeeded in hooking players into the story, setting a pace and introducing characters in an interesting way that perhaps distinguishes them to this day from other titles in the series. And as always, feel free to comment below with your own favourites, as I'm sure opinions do vary there. So, kicking off, I'll start with Final Fantasy IX because while, when looking broadly at the series in terms of an opening FMV, it wasn't the most action-packed of introductions, what it does brilliantly in the space of about 90 seconds is establish setting and character and immediately prompt intrigue for the player through foreshadowing and juxtaposition. And what I mean by that is, in the first few seconds of the FMV, we see a rowing boat being bounded about in a storm with a woman aboard, and this quickly cuts to Princess Garnet sitting in a window, dressed in full princess attire, which establishes her as royalty, but also with a slightly perturbed expression on her face that shows, she's perhaps a haunted past sort of character. We then cut to a wistful establishing shot of the Prima Vista airship entering Alexandria, which is great for grounding us and contextualizing the steampunk medieval setting. And then we have Zidane enter, and he's very quickly established as the opposite end of the class spectrum as Princess Garnet. So, excellent establishing shots here that tease past events and show our central heroes. But moving beyond this, and something that isn't really featured much in earlier Final Fantasy games, is an attentiveness to what we'd today call UX design, accessibility design, and player onboarding. As we take control of Zidane in the dark cabin of the Prima Vista, he strikes a match, and our only goal as the player is to walk forwards and light a candle. And this is interesting because not only is the pointer activated that hovers over Zidane and shows his whereabouts on the screen, but once we reach the candle, a modal window appears saying press X to light the candle or something like that. And this instructional onboarding design isn't something that we see much of in earlier Final Fantasies or JRPGs, owing partly to technology and limitations there, the relative simplicity of gameplay in JRPGs, but also because players were traditionally furnished with instruction manuals, and way back in the 90s these were often quite lengthy and gave all the relevant information as to controls and navigation and so on. So I did find it interesting that Final Fantasy IX was quite attentive to these things and highlighting these things on screen from a gameplay perspective. But moving on to story, and perhaps more importantly, the reason I think Final Fantasy IX ranks so highly as an introduction is how it introduced pace and the ensemble nature of the story right from the get-go. Because right after this Zidane segment, we have the Vivi introduction, and shortly after the Vivi introduction, we have the Steiner introduction, and each of these characters is introduced via a short FMV cutscene as well, which helps indicate their significance and their appearance within the story. So the quick succession of controlling these disparate characters paired with the FMVs is really good at establishing the cast, but the key to this, and why it works so well, is the pace and the fact that the circumstances of these characters quickly overlap and conflate around a singular event, which is the play, I Want to Be Your Canary. And this whole contained scenario concisely sets up the entire premise of the game's characters and their personal arcs and their interpersonal relationships. For example, Garnet laments her lot in life and seeks to escape. Steiner is a singularly committed knight in his duty to protect her. Vivi is inherently innocent and naive about the world, and Zidane is the affable rogue that seeks to bring everybody together, but also coincidentally has arrived to kidnap Garnet. So all of this is brilliantly done, and these disparate stories are established. And once this is set up and the theatre episode plays out, we enter the second post-intro phase of the game, which is the Evil Forest. And why this is significant is that these unlikely band of characters, who don't necessarily even like each other at this point, are forced to join forces and interact until they find their way back to civilization. So an excellent opening gambit for Final Fantasy IX there, and definitely one of my favourites in the series. Moving on, the next intro I'd like to talk about is Final Fantasy VIII, and this one is slightly more controversial for many Final Fantasy fans, but the reason why many criticised it is actually precisely the reason I think it succeeds. And to this day, I do find it a unique approach to how it establishes setting and story, and how it kind of approached the opening act of a JRPG game. So, first off, what Final Fantasy VIII opted to do, unlike its predecessors, is rather than show a concise FMV cutscene that leads neatly into an opening questline, as most Final Fantasies had done up to this point, what it did instead was opted for a cinematic montage that merged together current events, a foreshadowing of future events, and more abstract symbolism, such as the feathers floating around and stuff like that. And what this did was create something that was much more impressionistic, theatrical, and epic in tone. And indeed, the Labari Fatali soundtrack, which paired with these flashes of game events, it made it feel almost like a movie trailer as much as an opening cutscene. And while this was doubtless partly Squaresoft's intent, in my opinion, because it was showcasing the leap in graphical quality since Final Fantasy VII, what it also did was encapsulate brilliantly the thematic qualities of Final Fantasy VIII. And as I say, while some disliked it for being overly obtuse or confusing and perhaps nonsensical for a first-time player, looking at the themes that develop over the course of Final Fantasy VIII, such as the concept of time, the concept of fate, and of course the romantic element that propels much of that forwards, an opening trailer that offers flashes of points in time and significant turning points for characters. I thought that was a great opening set piece that has immense, if unclear, impact on a first playthrough, but retrospectively I think it makes sense and alludes to key events that unfold later down the line. And actually, if we think about Squall's ending animation, where he's having these abstract flashbacks to key moments in the past, it's interesting how that juxtaposes with the intro, which has flash forwards of abstract moments in the future. So, moving on to the opening gameplay, this was another controversial approach to some gamers, because where most Final Fantasy games throw you into the flux of an action and a specific event that sets things in motion, whether it's Furion being attacked by knights in Final Fantasy II, the Returners fleeing the Empire in Final Fantasy VI, or Avalanche arriving to bomb a reactor in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, by comparison, purposefully juxtaposes with its dramatic opening FMV and these other titles by having our hero wake up in an infirmary, being asked by a nurse whether his head hurts, and instead of dramatic battles and tense scenarios, we have a comparatively calm and comforting moment with birdsong, the Barlam Garden theme tune, which crafts a very peaceful, if anticlimactic, opening scenario instead. And for me, this was brilliant because, firstly, it effectively utilises the hero's journey trope of showing the protagonist in their familiar world before being thrown into a world of adventure, which games like Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII would also do quite successfully. But also looking broadly at Final Fantasy VIII, which is a coming-of-age tale, and in no small part is about Squall's transition into maturity, adulthood, and experiencing the realities of the world. Starting him off in this peaceful, studious school environment, and then comparing that soothing environment with later scenarios, like being stuck in space or Ultimicia's castle, I think it does a really good job of escalating that personal arc through setting and scenario, and the banality of his early experience, such as being asked if his head hurts, or giving Selphie a tour of garden, and doing training exercises with Quistis. This comparatively naive and infantile moment kind of contrasts hugely with his eventual leadership and the severe events that transpire later that he has to go through, culminating, of course, in saving the world. Now, on the note of Quistis, I think where Final Fantasy VIII does fall down in its opening act is its onboarding to the mechanics and specifically the leveling system. And where other Final Fantasy titles tend to pace onboarding, they weave mechanics into the gameplay experience through small dialogue segments such as Barret, or introducing the trance limit system in Final Fantasy IX with characters discussing that on the battle screen. What Final Fantasy VIII does is front-load loads of the learning, and specifically the rather complex junctioning system, into dialogue with Quistis. And in defense of this, I mean, yes, narratively speaking, Quistis is a teacher and Squall is her student, but alternatively, it's a lot of clicks to get through the onboarding wizard for the junction function, and then the GF leveling system as well. So it's a lot of clicks, it's a lot of dialogue, and I can't help but wonder if they could have staggered that and introduced it more conversationally and more subtly in terms of pacing in that opening moment of the game. But moving on, I think the opening act is brilliantly brought to its closure through the Dole mission. And again, narratively, it's an excellent segment that establishes characters like Squall and Cypher, the tumultuous relationship between those two. And it, of course, sows the seeds for later events, such as Cypher joining the dark side, and again further establishes Squall's reluctant relationship with party members such as Selphie and Zell. So in all, I think Final Fantasy VIII had a solid opening act that juxtaposed really well with preceding Final Fantasy games and really emphasised the warm heyday of studious youth before escalating into the war-torn realities and political intrigues of that particular world and story. And furthermore, we have the curious hook of seeing Alone almost immediately in the game story, and then Squall wondering who that curious girl is. So that's a great intrigue, a great initial mystery which gradually builds and develops through that personal arc as the game wears on. Now, moving on finally to Final Fantasy VII, its opening is something that has endured as a momentous turning point for JRPGs. And whether it's the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which has thankfully replicated that mostly intact, or the tech demos that have been teased over the years, the opening FMV is nothing short of iconic in how it ushered the player immediately and unapologetically into the chaos and action of its central story. And while this isn't unique to Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasies such as 2, 3, 4 and 6 each started off with an event that prompts immediate action, Final Fantasy VII's intro was significant on a number of levels. It landed at a particular time and place where technology permitted, graphical and audio improvements. It marked Squaresoft's transition to Sony from Nintendo, but also, perhaps more importantly, it took a step beyond as far as preconceived ideas of Final Fantasy and fantasy as a genre was concerned. And where earlier games, including 6, though to a lesser degree, operated in this Tolkien-esque arena of dragons and wizards fantasy, Final Fantasy VII shifted thoroughly into the realms of sci-fi, futurism, and dystopia, unlike anything that had come before it. So, with that in mind, if we think about the opening FMV, where we fade in to Aerith's face with mysterious green light floating around, we might think that we're in for something that's in keeping with earlier fantasy settings. However, as the scene progresses and the camera pulls out, revealing the dingy urban alleyway, and then trucks thundering past on a busy street, and finally retreating up to reveal the dystopian cyberpunk vibes of the Midgar skyline, we can see what an unprecedented departure this was in relation to earlier Final Fantasy titles, and how players at the time must have felt with this clear, monumental shift in direction in terms of aesthetic and setting. And even today, irrespective of this historical context, the escalation from an intimate close-up of a character to the macro city skyline and then pulling back down into the event scenario of the train pulling into Reactor 1 and Cloud & Co. jumping into action. It's a great jumping off point because it hastily establishes setting, it alludes to a significant character, and then it throws us right into gameplay without any context as to who we are or what we're doing. And where the conventions of fantasy usually have a hero in the known world before being thrown into adventure, Final Fantasy VII throws us right into the middle of action. We're halfway through an established scenario, and then it builds up through inference, and it's communicated to the player through things like dialogue, and specifically the combative dialogue between Cloud and Barrett. So it's all show and no tell, which I think was a very bold and great move for this particular introduction. And to zero in on the Cloud and Barrett scenario, it's made clear that they don't particularly know or like one another. It's made clear that Cloud is a specialist at what he does, which is a huge departure from the stereotypical hero ascent. And for his part, it's clear that there's a emotional detachment and reluctance in Cloud, which contrasts hugely with Barrett, who's waxing lyrical about the plight of the planet and so on. So through intermittent and brilliantly paced dialogue, we can build an initial impression of Cloud. And between Barrett, who distrusts him, Wedge, who's enamoured with him, and Jesse, who clearly likes him, the image of a cool and competent mercenary and hero character is delivered within the first 10 minutes of gameplay without having to explain who he is. And contrary to the earlier point about player characters such as Squall being onboarded to the mechanics as a rookie by the elder expert figure such as Quistis, Final Fantasy VII brilliantly switches this up by having Barrett, the guide figure, asking Cloud, the professional mercenary, things like, can you explain how materia works, and can you remind me how to equip slots because you're the expert? So the player is still educated in the mechanics and controls of the game, but without compromising that narrative premise that Cloud is a professional who knows this stuff. So I thought that was a really good way of approaching it, and maintained integrity with the story. The opening act of Final Fantasy VII also deals with the personal plight and initial mystery of Cloud, which is him having the minor freakout when it comes to setting the reactor bomb. And in tandem to this impression of him as an impressive soldier first class, things are already being set up to show that something isn't quite right, and we have this image of him that's established, which is eventually undermined as the personal reveals come later in the story. And in this regard, I think all due credit to Squaresoft with narrative pacing in these three games. And I think key takeaways for how they structured stories in these titles is how they sowed the seeds of a hero's haunted past early on. And as mentioned, we have Garnet's flashback of the boat, which is shown immediately in Final Fantasy IX. We have Alone immediately shown in Final Fantasy VIII, and we have Cloud freaking out in the first 10 minutes of Final Fantasy VII. So very interesting and early hooks that gradually unfold is a great formula that's used in these games when it comes to establishing the hero's journey. And secondly, another great takeaway is introducing stories with combative character relationships and scenarios where they are forced into proximity with one another, which develops over time. And for example, rather than outrightly telling players that Squall's a bit moody, or Zidane's a thief on the outside of the law, or Cloud's an emotionally detached mercenary, introducing friction through contrasting characters and dialogue is a successful means of establishing that and these primary and secondary character roles. And as we see, we find out a lot about Zidane and Steiner's personality and perception of the world through how they communicate with one another. And the same goes for Squall and Quistis, or Squall and Zell, and again for Cloudstrife and Barrett, or Cloudstrife and Tifa. And looking at these character relationships and their respective worldviews at the beginning of the game, and then considering them again by the end of the game, is usually where you can see how radically that character arc has taken place and how the character has evolved over the course of the game. So once more, the introduction and this opening gambit for character and story is crucial in how we perceive them and how we perceive their development over the course of the game. So just wrapping up on Final Fantasy VII, I think another interesting departure was that for all intents and purposes, the opening act in this opening reactor mission is a dungeon, and it's very uncommon for games to throw you directly into a contained dungeon scenario like that. And more broadly, we could even consider Midgar itself as the opening act and an initial dungeon, such is its containment as an early part of the game story. But I think this was managed really well, and I've stated previously that the entire Midgar segment permits the plight of the planet, the life stream, the Shinra, and the world to be established and posed to the player. And then it's Act 2 where the personal arcs and the personal intrigues really start taking off. And I'd say from about President Shinra's death, which is where we first start hearing about Sephiroth, that's where Act 2 kicks off. And then we go straight to the village of Calm. Cloud starts telling his story, which raises questions about him. We finally see Sephiroth via flashback. And this is where, you know, the pacing and the personal arc really starts catching up with the macro story and the setting. So brilliantly paced story in Final Fantasy VII. And in the original Final Fantasy VII in particular, where they held back on the Sephiroth reveal and maintained this mystery while the world building took place, and then delivered once we exited Midgar. You know, that was really excellent pacing, excellent narrative design, and I think that's why it endures to this day. So there we have it, quite a brief discussion on the introductions of 3 excellent Final Fantasy games. But I've always been interested to sort of drill down and start discussing these compartmentalized elements of narrative design, and particularly JRPG narrative design, which in my opinion is really interesting and sort of can reframe how we consider these games and why these games are so successful. So if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on Final Fantasy intros, whether it's these 3 or more broadly within the series.